Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, church? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast. Again, conversations that we hope will help you go deeper in your relationship with God. We're here again in the podcast studio at Fathom Church with Karina Bost. Hello, Karina.
Hello.
And Pastor Chris Martin. Hello, Pastor Chris.
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Y tarde y noche.
Yeah.
Español.
You're good at Spanish.
Bueno.
Very muy bien.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hey, speaking of languages, I just found out that there were multiple people in my church on Sunday speaking German. And so I would, which was a shocker.
Yeah.
That was a shocking moment for me. Mostly because I'm bummed I missed out on the German dialogue happening in the halls of Fathom Church. But it made me think a little bit. Talk to me about languages. Like, have you taken foreign languages? Do you speak anything, even like a little bit? Like, I think these are just interesting things. Like, I didn't know that people spoke German in my church.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you guys like? What hidden languages do you speak?
Can I go first? Because I know you actually speak really cool languages. And mine just, I took Spanish in school, in high school and middle school. It's like 4 years of Spanish. And I don't really remember a lot of it. So
Okay.
I can understand it better than I can speak it. So for the most part, I can kind of understand what people are saying, but
Wow.
the speaking wise, it's like, I don't really remember.
Code Red is almost
a lot
bilingual.
of it.
Yeah, good job.
I don't no, definitely not.
Very cool.
That's it. And my mom speaks some German.
Does she?
Yeah.
Sheila Knight. Shout out to Sheila
Yeah.
Knight.
Yeah, mom speaks some German,
Cool. All right.
but that's it. So
Wow.
I wanted to get that out of the way.
Yeah.
'Cause
Good job.
Mm.
Good job.
Karina
Yep.
to talk.
When I moved to Mancos, Colorado, in the elementary, they had Spanish every day. The only thing, I learned numbers, colors, all the basic things, but the only thing I remember learning, like that was more than a sentence, was the Pledge of Allegiance. So I can say the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish.
Wow.
But
the
that's
pledge
it.
of the Pledge of Allegiance, the American.
Yes.
It's not like a Spanish version,
Yep.
right? It's like
Yep.
in Spanish.
Yep, the American
That's
Pledge of
confusing.
Allegiance. Right?
Wow.
But
All right.
we would say it every day in English and in Spanish. So,
Hmm.
and then by the time we got to high school, the Spanish program kind of dropped away. Tiny town budget cuts. I think teacher hiring issues. I don't know. So that was the end of my Spanish journey. But now that my parents are in Thailand, I do speak some Thai, like enough to order a bowl of noodles and say hello and thank you. Not enough to really be helpful, but.
I'm serious. When we go to Thailand in the new year, you're gonna have to order me some serious noodles because I have.
Yeah.
Like when you were teaching at the
gosh,
missions
it made me
lunch,
so nervous.
when you were starting to say things, I was like,
I was getting
like, I don't
so
want to
nervous.
inflect my voice and be arrested. Okay, like I've got some
Yes.
serious anxiety around.
It's like, don't say it like that or else you're in big trouble. I'm like,
Well, yeah, tonal languages are really hard. English is hard because of all the rules. Like they say English is hard to learn when you come in here because all
Yeah.
the rules and exceptions to the rules. But the tonal language.
It's a whole different. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
like a different game. Wow, that's fascinating.
what about you?
Oh, I speak English.
Cool.
I've
Did you say
taken
Buenos
Spanish and I've
Dias?
taken French, and it's actually one of my regrets. If I could go back and
Mhm.
tell my younger self to do
Mhm.
something, I would have learned Spanish like fluently.
Yep.
A really close friend of mine did multiple years of Latin in high school. Went to a high school that like apparently was legit because they offered. He took AP Latin and got like
That's
a
awesome.
4 or a 5 or whatever you get on like a high grade on the AP exam. If I could, looking at my life today, if I could have Latin in the back pocket, I would feel real good. But to quote a famous comedian, I'm barely unilingual,
Mm.
So
Yep, I would go back. I would learn.
Yeah.
I would learn as much as I could.
I would have kept playing piano and I would have learned Spanish.
Yeah. I feel like when I was in high school taking Spanish, the only thing that kept me in Spanish classes and just barely getting by with passing grades was the few mission trips I took with my church as a youth, going to Spanish speaking countries and actually having to know some things like that. I was like, oh, now I really want to know Spanish. And then when I wasn't on those trips, I'm like, I don't want to know it. I didn't want to know it for school purposes,
Right.
but
it's a gift.
go
It's a
places.
gift. Ha.
Good one.
Hey-o.
Segue into what we are talking about. Thank you, Chris. What we're going to be talking about in this episode, as you can see by the title, we're going to talk about some spiritual gifts. We've been sort of talking about this a little bit here at Fathom Church. If you've been here the last few weeks, the last month or so, part of that is where we're at in our series in Ephesians, and Ephesians 4 kind of talks a little bit about that. But that also sparked just more discussions in our D groups, hopefully in your D groups, if you're listening to this, of your gifts, of your the Spirit given gifts to you. And we're going to be kind of talking about what are these spiritual gifts, because this is Pastor Chris said this right before we hit record, is like, this really is, man, when you think of like doing a podcast or having conversations about it, or what topics to discuss or answer questions about in a church, I feel like this is one of the biggest ones that always comes up, of people that just, whether it's have questions about spiritual gifts, don't understand them, or just are trying to figure out what theirs are. And so we decided to talk about that a little bit. So let's maybe just start out with Pastor Chris, like what are we talking about when we say spiritual gifts?
Yeah, so I think the most general definition that I could give, and is that a spiritual gift is any ability empowered by the Spirit for the edification of the church. So within in that definition, any ability. So there's categories that we can even break that into, whether it's something that you're just naturally inherently good at, or it's a skill that you've picked up, or it's something that kind of almost mysteriously comes upon you. It's an ability. It's a gift, right? That's the idea. Empowered by the Spirit. So it's something that God actually gives you some sort of spiritual power in. Mm-hmm. So he takes that ability and he juices it up with the Holy Spirit, with the purpose. And this is where it's very important. The purpose of spiritual gifts is always, and I say that almost without any qualification, always for the edification of the church. So if you take a quote spiritual gift and you use it to beat someone up, or you use it to further your own platform, or you use it in a selfish way, it is no longer functioning the way a spiritual gift is meant to function. It is meant to edify and build up the body of Christ.
Okay, good. So in starting there, do you want to talk about sort of these, how there's sort of three categories of gifts, of gifting, and those are gifts, service, or activities. What are the distinctions between those? Where do we get those from? And then we'll kind of go into like what maybe some specific gifts. We won't get into all those, but how do we figure out our gifts?
Yeah. So let me read 1 Corinthians 12, and then I'll talk about these three words. And then really, I think the benefit for our time together would be talking about like our experiences with gifts, whether that's things that we've had or things that we've experienced. But let me just do this real quick. 1 Corinthians 12, 4-7 says, "Now there are varieties of gifts." So that's the first one, but the same, or I'm sorry. No, I'm missing that one. There are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. Yes, gifts. There are varieties of service. That's the second one. So gifts and service, but the same Lord. Verse 6. And there are varieties of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them in everyone. So you have gifts, you have service, and you have activities. And that's kind of the rhythm that Paul builds out. Gifts is the Greek word charisma. So that's where we get words like charismatic, or, charis is kind of the root word there. And gifts tend to be like abilities or talents that you have that God redeems in you when he saves you to be used for his glory. So you might have a natural communication ability, or you might have a natural, very warm personality that God would use to be hospitable to outsiders or something like that. These are abilities, temperaments, the giftings that God gives you. Those are charisma, charis. The second one is service. There are a variety of service. That comes from the word where we get deacons, is diakonia, so the idea of like the office and role of deacon within the church, which is a servant. That's a service. There are different services. Sometimes this one I think is better translated as there's a variety of ministries. So I think this one is more of like a role or an outworking of that gift. So maybe you are gifted with a musical gift, and your ministry or your service is a worship ministry, or I mean, goodness, even somebody who would go and visit an elderly person in their church and just sing to them or sing with them. Like that's a service. That's a ministry. And then finally, the third one is that there are a variety of activities. Okay. And activities is the Greek word energema, which is where we get the word energy. And it's this, I think of activities in this case as more like moments when the Spirit infuses you with something that is used for, it's like think of like an energy boost or like a fueling real quick. So if you've ever, I maybe had like the prophetic sort of word come to you where you say, hey, I just feel like God's laying this on my heart for you. I feel like that's more of like it's not something you can kind of like, it's not a gift that you have all the time that you can just like use anytime you want. It's not necessarily like a ministry as much, but it's like the Lord just empowered you to do something. When people lay hands on somebody and pray for them to be healed and they're healed, I think that's like, one of those activities where it just happens. And the Spirit uses you in a way that you weren't even trying to be used in. And he just kind of activates you. So that may not be the only three kind of versions of this, but I think that's helpful that Paul kind of gives you multiple categories here, that it is abilities, but it's also ministries and things that you have a passion for. I have a heart for youth. That's a ministry. I have a heart for the homeless. That's like a ministry or a service. And then these activities where God just sometimes will supercharge you and use you far above the natural ability that you have. So even if you have a communication gift, every once in a while, the Lord might supercharge that thing for his good and for his glory and for your good, for the edification of the church. So that's how I would just kind of at a rudimentary level think through the gifts. But I mean, like I said earlier, I would really love to hear kind of what your guys' experiences have been, whether positive or negative, with your journey on figuring out your gifting and your spiritual gifts. So maybe Karina, if you want to share a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think growing up in the church, I felt like just like being involved in church work was the use of your spiritual gifts. It was just kind of like a misunderstanding I kind of carried on with me. But I think at some point I was really struggling, like, what are my spiritual gifts? And it was like sermons a couple years ago, I think, or maybe whatever. And there was, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, like taking spiritual gift tests later. Right. But I did take a test. But then I went and I actually sat down with Chris. I'm like, okay, like, what does this all mean? Because one of mine was the gift of apostle. And I was like, what does that mean? I was so confused by that. Which, Chris mentioned on Sunday in the sermon on spiritual gifts is like kind of more visionary. It lines up really well with the work I do as in like missions work and laying out the programs and stuff. That one was kind of unexpected. That one's still kind of new, like my understanding of it. But my other one that I always felt, I just hadn't named it, was the spiritual gift of faith. I've always had a supernatural faith, not just in like the reality of who God is, but in just, I think that supercharged piece. I've had experience of like that in faith. There are things where it's like, this will happen. And it's not something in myself. It's just examples where like, oh, let's see what God does this afternoon. And everyone's like, you're crazy. And then like, I was like, why? I just knew, that's kind of hard to explain. But so that's kind of been my biggest experiences with spiritual gifts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think mine too, also in growing up in the church. I mean, a lot of what you said, Karina, was like triggering some of the same, like, yeah, like growing up in the church, I felt like just serving wherever, being that like that whole like Swiss Army knife thing where it's just like, I will serve wherever and whoever needs it. I kind of thought that it was like, well, that's it, right? That like, that is what I was meant to do. Doesn't really matter where or when. And I think growing up in the church and being young and having that sort of gifting was a little, like, to be honest, it was like a little disappointing to me, because I was like just serve it. Like, it wasn't like a specific area or what I thought was like, oh, more of a specific gift of like, well, some of these people are gifted in, like, they've got the evangelism, like, man, they can, on like a mission trip, they will go up to anybody and just share the gospel with them. And I was like, I never really had like that one specific thing. I think growing up though, and being in the church longer, being actually like in ministry, working in ministry, I felt more of, and we talked about a couple of these a couple weeks ago in your sermon, Chris, of the shepherding and teaching. For me, teaching, I feel like, is a gift for me, but it's more of like, I love and it kind of goes with the shepherding piece, because I love teaching and being with people and guiding people. But what I really love and what I really feel like God is really using me is when it's smaller groups or kind of the one-on-one counseling sort of things. Not necessarily like preaching, that kind of teaching, but I love being with people and being in conversation with people and just guiding them kind of in that. That's why that's why I have such a passion for youth and for young people, and just talking things through with them, and guiding them that way. That's a gift of mine. And just the shepherding in general of like caring for people has always just been something like, man, seeing people hurt, seeing people in need of something. I think that's kind of where that whole service thing came from growing up, is where seeing a need, I'm like, man, like I just really want to get in there and
I think it's interesting, both of you guys growing up in church, kind of knowing about this and trying to figure out. When I got saved, I started hearing about spiritual gifts, and I thought like they were something, maybe this is the wrong word, but it is more spiritual. Like it was, I was always just kind of like, oh, I'd take like a test in my youth group or whatever, and it's like, oh, helps. And like, these are like weird things that I'm like, is that a gift? Like, what do you even, the categories felt bizarre to me. They felt like they were kind of forced, or they were so broad in general that it was like, oh yeah, sure, everybody's got a gift when it's like helping, or whatever. Right. And it wasn't until I really learned a little bit more about the gifts, and then I don't remember where I heard it, or at some point along the way, somebody just said, "What are you good at?" And I feel like that's where that was like a game changer for me. That yes, God sometimes will drop a spiritual gift on you, and you had no ability before, and he just, like a little bomb, hits you with it, and all of a sudden you can do something that you you were never able to do before. I do think that happens, but I think more often than not, God gives us abilities and talents and gifts, and then when he saves us, he redeems those. And so when someone was like, well, Chris, what are you good at? Now that is sometimes a tricky thing to figure out. Like, some people just don't know. Like, and there's some things you're like, am I really good at this or not? Like, I want to be good at this, but I'm not sure I am. But over time, I began to see, oh, okay, I have leadership giftings. Like, I just, even as a very young kid playing sports, I was always just kind of like the first guy to lead. I was just always the first one to speak up. That was just something in me. And then I think Christ redeemed that. Being in front of people was like the gift that I had. Like, I just never got scared doing plays at school and singing solos in choir and things like that. And that is translated into some of the ministries, the service that I do now. But I don't know that, like, it's a weird thing, I think, and confusing thing for people, because they're like, I've got to have some sort of mystical quest to figure out what my spiritual gift is. When in reality, you might be really good at fill in the blank. Like, you might be really good at soccer. And seriously, like, that might be your passion. It might be a thing you love. and God would want to redeem you by being a coach or by using that for some sort of outreach or ministry. I mean, I don't know what that might look like, but it could be something as secular or seemingly unspiritual as that God would actually, I think, want to redeem and use for the edification of the church.
Yeah. And actually growing up, I kind of thought of it that way too, because hearing spiritual gifts, I was like, that sounds a little weird. Because we didn't growing up in my church, we didn't really talk about spiritual gifts, but really hearing that. And this is what I tell the youth now. And even a few weeks ago when we talked about this is breaking it down into more of the language of like, what are you good at? I think really, really helps. Because I think even as adults, that spiritual gifts kind of piece is like, oh, I don't have a weird, it's that weird spiritual gift kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think though, also having people, for me, especially with the spiritual gift of faith, it actually took people outside of me because I thought that level of faith was normal.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until someone was like, I think yours might be faith. And then I kind of saw like the footprint of it in my past and was like, oh, that makes sense. But what I was living out of was more of like, this is just how everyone lives. And so sometimes if you really are stumped, it feels so, it might be so ingrained that just taking someone outside of yourself to be like, hey, what do you think my spiritual gift is? And
that's a great point. And I think I want to ask this of like, how do we figure out our spiritual gifts of, I know I think we even still have a spiritual gifts assessment on our website, I think.
Yeah, maybe somewhere
somewhere on there. There's plenty of those to take. But how else? I mean, there's a lot of scripture that talks about some of these, and some of these can be like, oh, well, that's weird. That's not me. Like, that's definitely not me. I'm not good at that. And I think some people get into that mode. Some Christians get into that mode of like, well, I don't fall into any of those. How do I figure out what my spiritual gift is? So what is maybe your guys's, maybe how, like Karina, like you just said, like how you kind of came to be that, like you figured that out, or some tips or some guidance on for people who are trying to figure out what their spiritual gift is.
Yeah, I think so. Karina mentioned a test, and you did as well. I think you can go online and find tests, and I think those are a helpful tool. I actually wouldn't say that's what you should do first, though. I think first and best is always going to be in relationship. So I do think having a conversation with a trusted spiritual guide, whether that's a mentor or a friend or a parent or a family member or a pastor, a minister at your church, like I think that would be a good place to start. If you do want to go the route of like a test or something like that, I would coach you the same way I would coach somebody about personality tests like Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or DISC or something like that. And what I would say is I think it's better rather than take the test and let it tell you, I think you should read the descriptions of the gifts and see which one you think you have. And then if you could take the test and see if that affirms that or confirms it or not. But I think it's better to discover your gift than it is to be told your gift by a test. And I always will prefer community to just you sitting, in your room with your phone or your computer trying to figure this out. That'd be my 2 cents. I don't know, Karina, if you got anything to add to that.
No, yeah, I totally agree, because I think if it becomes like this self journey, it can very quickly become distorted, or you can kind of start working out of things that are unnatural to you. Oh, this test told me this is my gift, so I better start serving in this way. And I think you'll find yourself heading towards burnout if you're constantly, not that God can't use you in gifts that aren't yours, but I don't think he calls us to exclusively work outside of our gifting.
Yeah. And we've talked about this too. And if you're a part of a D group, I mean, that's a great place to, like, we're kind of going through that now with our group each week of like talking to, like, kind of just speaking encouragement into each person of the giftings that we see in them. And it's just so helpful too with, especially with our D groups and how they're different ages and stages. And just hearing other people who have known you for a little while, who have been with you each week, going through a lot of this stuff of life, just speaking these things to you. I also think that really it's, for me, it's if you're whether it's you're like serving in the church or you're like on a Sunday morning or something, if you find yourself doing something, helping out somewhere, like kind of filling a gap or something like that, like what is it that really, like afterwards, that you just felt like this joy that you were like, man, I just feel like super awesome of what I was able to do here at church today. And I guess that really, like, it brings me to this question that I feel like some people, if we haven't figured out really what our gifting is, like if what we feel like we're good at, if it doesn't fit within, I think some people think if it doesn't fit within the ministry of the church or all the volunteer opportunities that we have, because we have a lot of volunteer opportunities, but we don't have everything for everyone. But if there's not that opportunity, I think some people are like, well, then I must not be gifted at all. If my church doesn't have a spot where I can use my gift, or I can't use my gift, then maybe that's not it. Or maybe I'm just not gifted. What do we say to those people, Chris?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, we have programs at the church that need volunteers, and absolutely, like that. I think it's really a good thing. Even if you can't find one that's like a 1-to-1 correlation with a gifting, I think it's good for you to find some sort of ministry or service inside your local church to be a part of. And sometimes that's sacrificial, and sometimes that might line up perfectly with your gifting. And then all other times, I mean, Karina, you did say this, like God will use you outside of your gifts as well. So I think there's some of that where it's like, I think it's okay. I think it's okay to sometimes say, I don't get this passionate rush of delight every single time I serve in kids ministry, but I do love the thought of these children being loved and discipled and prayed over. And so I'm going to serve this way.
I think that's important.
I don't want to, well, I'm not going to, because you can use that excuse. I'm not going to serve at my church because there's, I'm just not gifted in any of these ways. Well, you know what? You can probably hold some babies and pray over them.
Mm-hmm.
You can probably, help us run slides or greet or help make coffee, or maybe it does fit up with your passion and it's music or what. So I want to buffer that statement like that. The other thing though is, and I said this in our D group that when we were reviewing Ephesians 4, I think we need to be more creative. Like I think a creativity with how we exercise our gifts is probably necessary. Because I think far too long it's been like there's this elite status of gifts, like the really good gifts are like leading worship and teaching youth and preaching and being the church treasurer and like whatever little buckets we created in the church, that those are somehow like the good elite edifying of the church gifts. But then there's like these like secondary gifts that are maybe just whatever. And I just think there's probably creative ways to use your gifting. So, I mean, we already mentioned the soccer thing, but let's just say you're an artist. I don't know, you paint or something like that. And, we don't have a painting ministry at Fathom. There's some charismatic churches that do, but that's not really our jam. Is there a way you can serve and or edify your church? Well, I mean, maybe that comes in a real formal programmatic way by like helping us with design or something like that. That's a little less traditional. Or maybe you paint cards and write notes of encouragement and send them to people in your church, right? Like, is that a programmatic ministry of Fathom Church, like the painting card sending ministry? No, like we don't have a sign up sheet for that. Okay. But that's you using your gift to edify, to build up the body. So I think some creativity will really help you begin to dream about what God might actually want to use your gifting for. And it doesn't have to look like a Sunday morning program piece here at Fathom. What do you think about this, Karina?
Yeah, I think we look at serving in the church and we see the really obvious visible things. Well, and not only like obvious and visible, but like functionally important. You can't, church on Sunday, you have you need a place for the kids. We need someone up there leading worship. We need someone preaching. Those are like foundational pieces of a Sunday morning, but I totally agree with you. The creativity piece. And I think I just kind of love the concept of that, mostly because I thrive in creativity. And so just I know there's lots of ways for gifts to be used. And you've probably, maybe some of you have been thinking like, I've been thinking this forever and no one's asked me. And I think sometimes part of that gifting that God's given you is to be courageous enough to step forward and say, I have this gift I want to use. I don't think it's about waiting around for someone to like present the opportunity to you. It's more so within a church, we don't necessarily know the giftings of the whole entire, like I know I don't know the whole entire fellowship well enough to know the giftings of everyone. I could speak into my D group, my kids, those kind of things. But I think that's like the whole reason why community is so important, to be able to say, hey, I have this gift. How can I use it creatively in this church or in our community, those kind of things. Because sometimes when you start brainstorming by yourself, you might not be able to come up with the card idea, but you throw three minds together and you could probably come up with some really creative.
And I think,
fun.
and I know we've got to wrap this up. So I think this is kind of a messy endeavor. Like it's not a clear A to B, like point A to point B, direct line to get to I'm using all my gifts. Like it's going to take some trial and error. Like if you don't know what your gifts are, it's going to take some courage to say that. It's going to take some courage to come out and talk with people and say, hey, help me with this. It's going to take some courage for you to try some things. Maybe you don't know because you've not tried. You might fail at some stuff, right? So like this is going to be messy and we're going to fumble this a little bit. But that's the joy of doing this in community, is that we're going to give grace to one another to figure this. I mean, I wouldn't be preaching if I'd never gotten a chance to try it. You know, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing vocationally as a pastor without somebody just saying, hey, to like a dumb teenager, why don't you try this? Like, what would that look like if you gave that a shot? And I think that investment paid off ultimately. So I did put this quote in our notes. This is where maybe we can end this one at. But C.S. Lewis said in one of his lesser known works, but he said this quote, and I think it's really helpful when we talk about the gifts. He says, "For God seems to do nothing of himself which he can possibly delegate to his creatures. He commands us to do slowly and blunderingly what he could do perfectly and in the twinkling of an eye." And I just love that idea that with our gifts, we are going to fumble and bumble and slowly and even imperfectly accomplish the things that God wants us to accomplish. And yeah, he could snap his fingers and just, everybody could be fed and everybody could be served and everybody could be encouraged and everybody could be blessed. And yet he almost always seems to do nothing himself that he can delegate to us. That's the great joy of being a Christian, is that we get to partner with him in what he's trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was good conversation. Hey, if you're listening and you don't know, you really are struggling with trying to figure out your gift, talk to people, talk to your group, reach out to one of us, one of the staff members, pastors, just talk about it, bring it up to us. If you have a gift and you want to use it for building up Fathom Church, come and talk to us and we'll figure something out, because we want you to use your gifts here. So thank you both for this great conversation. Thank you, church, for listening, and we'll see you next time.